Welcome back, aliens. My name is Devin Reddy, and let's continue the series on Spring Framework. Now, till this point, we have seen Spring Boot and Spring, and then we were able to achieve the same thing in both the projects. So basically, the demo Spring, the project which we have created, is for the normal Spring without Spring Boot, and then the My App is basically the same thing with the help of Spring Boot. If you can see the classes, we got the same number of classes and interfaces. We got computer, we got desktop, we got dev, laptop, and then the main class. If you go to the demo Spring, the same thing, we got app, which is the main class, and then we got a computer, desktop, dev, and laptop. And we are doing the same thing. So if you go back to your desktop, or maybe if you go back to your developer, you can see in the developer, we are doing the same thing. We are calling a method of the computer. And if you go to my app, I think it will be done the same thing. Yeah, so we have the computer object in dev, and then we are trying to call compile. Both are same, right? But if you look at what is different is the configuration. Now, both are doing the same thing, but the configuration is different. If you look at the project with normal Spring, if you want to configure this, we have to use a XML file. Of course, there are other options as well, but we have gone for XML. So in the XML, we have to mention everything what we wanted. If you want to get a bean, you have to mention that. If you want to have auto wiring, you have to mention that. So everything need to be done in the XML file. The problem is most of us don't like configuration. Even if you see, sometimes we don't have a choice. We have to do configuration. But then when you have an idea, if you want to implement something, and if you spend most of your time in the configuration, somewhere you lose a track of the project, or you lose the interest, or you spend time debugging your configurations. Example, I have worked a lot on XML, so I find it easy now, or maybe I'm comfortable to work with XML. But if you are new to XML files or XML configuration, even if a small spelling mistakes will create issue. Of course, it will not give issue here. Example, if I make a mistake here, because of the IDE, I'm getting the error. But if I'm not using an IDE, and if you run this, if you use a simple IDE, which is not showing you this error, and if you run this, and then you spend a lot of amount of time debugging what went wrong, right? So that's one of the issue with the configuration. On the other hand, if you talk about our project of Spring Boot, there's no configuration file. Of course, there is a configuration file which I want to show you, which is the application.properties. And of course, you can set your properties here. But at this point, we have not done that. We only got one property, which is optional. You can also remove this. Apart from that, there's no configuration in the property file or the XML file. We are doing those configuration with the help of annotations. And sometimes it is easy to work with annotations. And at least it is easier to debug. So you know what is going wrong where. Now, I just want to compare these two projects. If you go back to your Spring project, you can see whichever class I open, nowhere we are using any annotation. Not even here, not in dev, not in laptop, not in app. There's no annotation anywhere, right? And whatever we have to do that in XML. In XML, what we have done is we have created these beans, and we are using AutoWire also. We also specified primary here. If you want to compare this with the Spring Boot, we don't have XML, but if you look at the classes, we got dev class. On top of that, we are using add component. So instead of using a bean tag, we are using add component. Then we are using add autowire for the auto wiring. We are using add qualifier. We can also use primary. I think when we go for the desktop or laptop, okay, we have not mentioned, but you can do that. So you can mention primary here. So we can mention primary here, and that is similar to what we have done here, okay? And so basically what we are doing is we are using different annotations. How do we start the container? So if you go back to your main application file or main file, using this line, we are starting the container. In case of Spring, the normal Spring project, we have to use this new class path XML configuration, and this will start the container. So both are doing the same thing, but in Spring Boot, we are doing less configuration. But the magic is, whatever you are doing in Spring Boot, behind the scene, it is using the Spring Framework, okay? So yeah, ultimately we are using Spring Framework even if you are using Spring Boot. So those are the changes in these two projects. And as I mentioned before, we'll only focus on the Spring Boot from now. Before we go ahead, I want to talk about more things. See, ultimately we are going to build a project, right? And we have discussed this in the first few videos. So we are going to build a project, and the project which you're going to build is a web project, right? So whatever we have done till now, that's basically your console project. And now we want to work on the web project. So whatever annotations we have used or the configuration we have used, that's for standalone project. Now, when you talk about web, things are a bit different. How it is different? First of all, when you want to work with a web project, and if you're not using Spring, if you're using normal Java, and if you want to build a web project, so what's so special about web project? The thing is, the web is hosted on the server, and it will accept the request from the client. So in this case, we do have a client here who will send the request to the server, and server will respond back. And this thing is happening on the internet with the help of HTTP protocol. So we have to use this protocol to achieve this, okay? And this is hosted on the server. So that means the application which we are building should be capable enough to accept the request over the internet, which is your HTTP request, right? So this has to be something special. So you can't simply run this on JVM. JVM is only for the machine. Now, if you want this to work on the server, basically we need something called a web server or a web container, basically. And what you work with Java, or what you use in Java, is something called servlets, okay? And servlets run in the web container. We also call that container as a servlet container. But which container we have to use, which software we have to use, which tool we have to use. And the name of the tool is Tomcat. So basically we have to use Tomcat to run the servlets. But hold on, we are talking about Spring here, right? We want to use Spring. So even if you're using Spring Framework, ultimately, behind the scene, Spring is going to use servlets, okay? And it will run on Tomcat. So if you want to make a web application using Spring, behind the scene it will get converted into servlets, which will run on the Tomcat. So it's important for us to use Tomcat as well. Now the question is, if you want to use a Tomcat here, we have to install Tomcat, we have to run our project. Spring Boot says you don't have to worry about that. In the project itself, in the project folder in your IDE, you will get the embedded Tomcat. So you will be having Tomcat inside your project. So you don't need external Tomcat. Those were the beautiful days where you have to do a lot of configuration for the Tomcat, set the port number, make sure it is running, create a var file of your project, then put it on inside Tomcat. Listening to it looks a lot of steps, right? And literally it was a lot of steps. But now because of embedded Tomcat, you don't have to worry about it. With your project, you will get the Tomcat, you can run it anywhere you want on the machine, not on your car. Okay, come back. So basically we have Tomcat here. Next, we need some layer which will accept the request. So if you remember, in the first few videos, we have talked about different layers we are going to create. We have a controller layer who is responsible to accept the request. Then we have to use service layer and repository layer. Now these are normal classes, but then this controller is a special class because it was going to accept the request from the client and also respond it. And we have to understand how this works. So even before we start with the project, we'll focus on how do we create this controller. And to achieve that, we have to first understand Spring MVC. In fact, Spring Boot MVC. We'll be using Spring Boot here to achieve that. And how it works, let's understand that in the upcoming videos. We'll start with Spring Boot.